just answering questions with waptek off the top of my dome, meaning I'm not going to look up anything. I'm just going to do this for my brain. Wondering, I understand what two-dimensional and three-dimensional means, but is there such a thing as one-dimensional? The more I think about it, I can't fully wrap my head around two-dimensional. The reason being that any surface, like a sheet of paper, for example, has a certain amount of depth. Then as soon as you draw on or paint on it, it adds more depth. And the same thing goes for one-dimensional. How can you have one dimension? Even a string has depth or thickness. This is the reason we think of it this way. One-dimensional space, or a single dimension in space, is essentially incapable of existing in a way that we can perceive because it doesn't have the ability at that point to carry any form of matter or anything we can experience as an effect or lack of sensibility about it. In two dimensions, which you could potentially have a two-dimensional something, we would be able to see it from our three-dimensional perspective through the surface of it. And on edge, we would see what it would appear to be a line being a pattern of some sort of activity, especially if it was a form of energy being dispersed into time-space as two dimensions. Our lack of the ability to, however, and obviously with three dimensions, we can perceive it by just existing in it. But one dimension is a very big problem because, even if you could have something that literally has zero dimension in one direction, light can technically have polarization to the point that it is, in effect, as close as possible to being zero thickness. Even the waves in it can be polarized in such a way that they do not try to escape that set of two dimensions, so that the third dimension is little or no effect of being altered. And you would easily be able to perceive it simply because of the way we're able to detect things just by getting in the way of it. But a single dimensional thing being measured, well, how would you detect it from the side? You can't. It's literally too thin to detect because it's not emitting anything. And if something's emitting something or is an emission in a straight individual line, like the pathway of a single particle, or literally one photon, it would only be detectable if you literally got lucky out of all of the infinite number of pieces of space you could be in the pathway, and then it would cease to exist because it would go into your eye. Unless it's a mu meson or something else that can go right between all the parts of the atoms in your body and go straight through you, in which case you wouldn't absorb anything from it, except maybe a disruption and possible cancer. So, yeah. And three-dimensional space has a seemingly infinite amount of space that can hold all these dimensions. And then you go to four dimensions and you're dealing with multiple copies of a three-dimensional entire universe, all overlapping with each other. The only reason they don't interfere with each other is called time, which is, again, a dimension. And this is when it gets easy to understand unidimensional items, time. We experience it all by itself as time. We experience voltages on a wire as being a single dimension of change, and it just has a single value, and that's the end of it, if it's a DC battery. But it has variations, and eventually the battery even goes dead, so it does change. So it's always going to form a two-dimensional matrix of some kind. The idea with a single-dimensional anything is that it would never, if we were to think of it as something easier to perceive, it would never change value, which can't exist. But then again, it has only one dimension. It has no matter to it. By nature, unidimensional items are almost always thought of as being examples of like energy or power levels or whatever, being something that doesn't have any mass, volume, or effect in most cases. So I understand the question-ish. However, due to the challenge of being able to understand some of these characteristics of reality, this question is actually kind of hard to determine if it's asking the right way. We often start with our presumptions, and I have it in this case. Now, why am I not looking up anything or posting anything? This is more of a philosophical question or a perception problem. I treat it as such. But anyway, this was interesting. It's actually easier. You can talk to mathematicians. Oh yeah, one dimension's easy, unless you're doing something with it. Doing four-dimensional and polydimensional math involving several different dimensions at once that all exist at the same time in our universe, by the way, is much easier. A real example of this is measuring the movement of an object inside of a room over time. That's four-dimensional math, which means you're doing an animation, apparently. And it is going to have a characteristic of changing temperature. That's a unidimensional thing. It changes over time. It's a one-dimension change. Do you graph it? And that becomes the problem. Now you're running into so many things, you can't even make a graph paper for it. I'm more comfortable with doing that than dealing with one dimension. So I understand this. It's kind of spooky. But it was an interesting question. But no, I'm not going to give an educated answer on it because it's a what if in my mind. But I think it's based mostly on our lack of the ability to truly perceive it. And yes, it is kind of torques the brain to realize unidimensional things, unless it's involving a voltmeter or, temperature measurement or something, we don't experience them very much. And then if we dealt with the one dimension as a physical dimension, you realize how much of a pain in the ass it would be to detect, and how it would be self-terminating if we did. If it was anything worth detecting, like a ray of sunshine or a ray of neutron. Thanks for watching. Have a good day, and good luck with all.